Hello and welcome to Sensei podcast. This is Manos Brilakis discussing with leaders in the field of CTO and complex PCI. Sensei means teacher or master in Japanese. The goal of the Sensei podcast is to help you learn and improve in CTO and complex PCI so that you can become the best that you can be and offer your patients the best possible results. Hello everyone and welcome to Sensei podcast. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Maksymilian Opolski from the National Institute in Warsaw in Poland, where he's the director of the CTO and complex PCI program. He's a great friend, great operator, and has had a great course teaching us about coronary CT and quality of life and many other things that we're going to touch on this. So, Maksymilian, thanks again so much for being on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you, Manos. It's a great honor to be here with you in the Sensei podcast, which I actually really like and enjoy.
Wonderful. Maksymilian, how did you go into cardiology?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, during my medical studies, I wanted to become a neurologist. And I was really on this path. But then when I saw that, you can't really help these patients, and it's more like diagnosing these patients, I thought, well, I would like to make a difference. I would like to make something different. And then I was supposed to become a cardiac surgeon, by the way. And when I saw that, the cardiac surgeon comes to work actually at like 5 or 6 a.m. and I'm a kind of guy who likes sleeping right in the morning. And he's back home at 8 or 9 p.m. Then I thought, well, that's not for me, because I actually can stand up late and I can work like hell. But I said, well, that's not the kind of work for me. And by the way, when I saw the first bypass operation, I actually fainted. And I was really ashamed of that. So I said, well, that's also not this path. And then I saw a senior interventional cardiologist doing PCI. And that was, I think, the moment that was like, a turning point when I said, well, that's the thing I would like to do. I saw these precise movements of his hands. I saw this, delivery of the balloon and stents. And most importantly, I saw the great effects. The patient had symptoms in angina, and he went back home after one day. And I said, well, I want to become interventional cardiologist. So that was the start, actually.
And this was in Warsaw. Where was your training done?
Yeah, actually, that was in Warsaw during my medical studies. I think I was, after the 4th or 3rd medical year. And that was at the Medical University of Warsaw, actually. And then I was always much into science. So there are these scientific circulation or circulatory components in clinics in Warsaw, like scientific council. And I went to one of these councils after my, I think, 4th medical year. And that was a great time, because this center, and that's actually my center, the center I work now, the National Institute of Cardiology in Warsaw. They just got a new CT device, a new CT scanner, and we were much involved in the scientific work, actually combining CT in patients with heart disease. And I was involved in that. And then I actually worked quite hard. And a friend of mine who was in charge of this, medical students, he said, well, you're quite a hard worker. Maybe you could go. And I can already remember the moment when I got a message from him. I was skiing in the south part of Poland, and I opened up email, and he texted me, well, maybe you would like to go to Washington, D.C., because he had connections. He already was there to analyze IVUS, to Gary Mintz and Neil Weissman. And I said, well, why not? But he replied, that's going to be a hard work. You have to work all day long during your vacation, summer vacation, 3 months long, no weekends, nothing. You will have no time for traveling. I said, well, I'm in. So I went there. And I was working quite hard with a friend of mine, a colleague from the same center. And we actually finished up 2 research projects that was related to analyzing IVUS and the stent strut distribution. And we're actually looking at the relationship between stent strut distribution and in-stent restenosis based on the Taxus 4, 5, and 6 trials. And at the very end of this stay, I came up with the idea that I could analyze and look at the stent fracture and the relationship between stent fracture and stent thrombosis. And I texted Gary Means, well, does it make any sense? He said, well, let's look into that. Sounds nice. So I was working, like hell, not much sleep, and I finished it up because there was not much time. Then I came back and I sent this abstract to ACC, and I went there as a medical student. I think I was the 6th year, and I presented the poster about this subject. And that was the first time I actually heard about CTO PCI, because the guy standing next to me had an abstract about coronary CTO. I asked him, what's that? He said, and that's actually the first time I heard about CTO, but that was just the start, and still a long way to go.
So it was meant to be. So you took you took hold of the opportunity and you made the most of it. And obviously, it does help immensely working with some of the leaders in the field. So then, how did you after the medical school? How did you end up going into intervention and then into the CTO world?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that was, as I already said, quite a long way ahead. So first, I was helping a friend of mine, a cardiologist, about the medical project about actually patients who had CTO of LAD. You won't believe in that. And that were patients who were actually rejected from CABG and also from PCI, because we didn't have experience at that time with CTO PCI in my center, right? So, and that was quite interesting because we ran cardiac CT in these patients, and they were sent for quite an old-fashioned, and I think hardly ever used now, procedure, which is called transmyocardial laser revascularization. We had that at this time, during this time, that was, I think, 2009, 2010. So these patients were rejected from CABG. They went for these procedures, and they got CT just to look at distal CT of the LAD. And the surgeon, who was quite good, he tried to get a bypass graft, to suture a bypass graft, even though there was a deferral based on coronary angio. And that was actually my PhD. And that was quite interesting because we validated the diameter on cardiac CT of the distal CT of LAD that could actually predict the successful anastomosis and, the successful suture of the bypass graft. I think 2/3 of these patients got bypass grafts and 2/3 just transmyocardial laser revascularization. And then we went for doing a follow-up. So that was the first time I had, besides this poster at ACC, some contact with CTOs. And then I actually started working in the cath lab quite early on, although I was doing other stuff as well. But we had very, very simple CTO PCI program. And actually, I know I'm going to go to CTO PCI, but everything else was actually taken, like the cake was cut, and that was the only thing left. No one wanted to do CTO PCI. And there is a guy, and there was a guy. It's a great friend of mine, a colleague, an older senior cardiologist who was, doing and running this CTO PCI program, Dr. Dembski. But that was, most of the time antegrade wiring, very few retrograde, mainly through bypass grafts procedures, like 1 or 2 per year. So we didn't have much experience at that time. And then I actually always wanted to go abroad again, besides medical studies. So I applied for EAPCI grant. I failed. No, failure is quite a good word regarding CTO PCI. And then because of my interest in cardiac CT, I actually went and I was sending abstracts to SCCT, which is, actually a CT community in United States. And I met Stefan Achenbach from Erlangen. And he helped me so much. And we published a lot together. And then he helped me and he said, well, I said, I failed with the CAPCI grant and I would like to go abroad. And he said, well, try the scholarship of the German Cardiac Society. So I thought, well, why not? I wrote an application. I waited like nine months or something and I got it and I went there for 1 year to Bad Nauheim between Gießen, Frankfurt am Main for 1 year, just 2 months after my wedding, by the way. And
congratulations.
Yeah, that was 2012. And I worked there and that's how I validated and developed the CT rector score, because that was the main subject of my grant and my scientific work there. So that was based on 4 centers, our center in Warsaw, the Kirchhoff Clinic in Bad Nauheim, Gießen, where Holger Neff was in charge, and Erlangen, where Stefan Achenbach and the other guy did CTO PCI. But I didn't do much CTO PCI at that time, even though I got medical license in Germany in the Kirchhoff Clinic, because that was not the main area of interest in that center. That's a great center, but they did most of the time structural interventions. And then I went back to Warsaw, having not much of a knowledge, but I was already on the path. I want to do CTO PCI because I reviewed and I analyzed all of these procedures from these 4 medical centers, and I said, that's the thing which I want to do. But it was really hard in Poland. We had just one medical conference. There were some Japanese guys coming, and I went there, but I didn't understand what they're doing. Actually, that was like a rocket science, the hocus pocus. And then I was actually I was put in contact with James Mean. And that's a long story. I'm sorry, but that's how it looked.
No, this is amazing.
From New York Presbyterian. And I approached him through Stefan Achenbach, and I wanted to learn. Actually, I wanted to publish based on the Confirm registry, which is the biggest CT registry in the world, about CTOs itself, right? So I was put in contact with James Mean and a great statistician, Heidi Granzer, and we actually published 2 papers in Heart. And then, we are texting, sending emails. That's a long story. It took like 3-4 years, and then James texted me, and he said, and he wrote, well, I think you should meet Paul Knappen. He's so crazy about CTO PCI as you are. And that was just before ESC in 2016 in Rome. And I said, why not? That's great. And he said, well, I'm going to come there. I'm going to introduce you to Paul Knappen. And I was actually giving a lecture because I was invited to give kind of state of the art, let's say, call it this way, lecture about CT guided PCI. I mean, the general view. So I went there, I gave this lecture, and I came back home. That was quite a small apartment in Rome. It wasn't even a hotel. And James texted me, well, the dinner is gonna start in 2 hours, but I'm not gonna be there. I will not make it. But you should go. And I was like, kind of sitting on the fence. Should I go there? I don't know anyone, besides James, and he's not gonna come. And I was really not much about going there. But then I said, well, let's try it. So I'm quite bad as looking for the places. So I tried. I saw the way that was quite a long way. I took the subway or something, and I got lost. And then I found, and after some like 30 minutes, I was on the right way again. And then I think the dinner was already over. And then I saw the people there, and I saw Paul, who was quite easygoing after dinner, and having some fun and laugh with his friends and his department. And I started talking with the guy, and then he said, well, you should go to Amsterdam. I'm going to teach you CTO PCI. And I was very enthusiastic about that. I said, well, yes, but then I was at the like hard moment. I wanted to go abroad at this time, and I had a lot of kind of applications and conference calls, mainly in Germany. But the people didn't reply, or the answer was negative or something. So I said, well, we had a nice dinner, we drank some wine, he will not come back to me. But then after like 2 weeks, he called me, and he said, well, you should apply for a kind of grant, you should come, you're well invited. And actually, I applied for a kind of traveling grant of the Polish Ministry of Health and Education, and I got it, and I went there, and that's how the whole story, started off with the complex PCI as well, and that was the decisive moment. I mean, that was the turning point, and frankly, it reinvigorated my career from that time.
Wow, so it's amazing. Every time something would appear, you would take advantage of it. Take all the opportunities, because many people have opportunities like you do. Go abroad or do things, but not everyone wants to put the work in. And it takes obviously effort. It takes determination. It takes inconvenience, because you're leaving your country. You're going to a foreign area. You don't know people. It's a hard work. There's a lot of stress involved, but you made the most out of it. And clearly that has been amazing. And I know that city rector now is coming into front stage again, because of the increased emphasis on city guided PCI for CTO and in general as well. So in a way, you've been well ahead of the curve in that particular area. So how was the training? Because at the time, so you already had worked as an interventionalist, right? How was it getting trained again, essentially, into the complex part of PCI?
Well, that was definitely a game changer. I think when I saw the guys doing this, remarkable things which were not used to doing in Warsaw and also, in Germany. We had this, let's say, conservative school about, doing PCI. When I saw that, well, I thought it's amazing. It's just, a different part of interventional cardiology. You can solve every case, or almost every case. And there are a lot of techniques. It's really truly complex PCI. So I was exposed to CTO and complex PCI from the very get-go. I remember, I can recall the first procedure I did together with Paul and Alex Knapp. That's a great team. In a post-CABG patient, and the moment they cannulated the graft to get a retrograde approach, they popped in guide extension through the whole grafts, almost to the anastomosis, and just to get more support and to augment your strength. And they went retrograde, after went and finished up in a reverse card maneuver in a very time-efficient way. From that moment, I knew I want to do it more right, and it changed. It changed, and I think it changed me as a person. I was, quite gentle as doing CTO PCI. I was not enough quick. I was quick, but I was not insanely quick, right? So I started working on the details, and I started working on my weaknesses, right? And I really truly focused on that. And then there was this mental training, because I think Paul is a great psychologist. So he wanted to change me as a person, not just about your speed or your hands, because I think the mental part, that's the key, that's the linchpin of CTO PCI. So we had this long-term relationship as friends. We were talking and chatting and texting after a complex case, and he changed me, both Alex and Paul, as a person. And I think uh, that was the most important point. And then there was, like, I think, optimal meeting. I met James Prater and Julian Strange, um, Simon Walsh, who is a great, amazing operator, and Colm Hanratty. And I saw the guys and I said, well, uh, that's not my, let's say, goat mountain. I want to be one of them, right? Um, yeah, so that's it.
And what did you find to be the most difficult thing to learn when you were training?
That's a tough question. Well, I don't know I know the right answer to that. I think I wouldn't go into the very much technique part of CTO PCI. I would say the most difficult thing to learn and to master is to actually learn how to fail and how to actually deal with failures, because you're gonna fail much more often than your other colleagues. So that was the most difficult part uh, for me, because I was kind of a person who was, I always had plan A. I stick to plan A, and I didn't really like to change my plan A to plan B or C, like backup plans, because that made me kind of away from plan A. And I was always, this kind of person, very precise, detailed, and I had to change that, right? Um, your hybrid algorithm, by the way, Manus. So that was the most difficult thing for me. So to learn how to embrace failure, uh, and how to actually brave the risk of failure. Because I think if you want to be a good CTO PCI operator, you have to, fall up, as they say, 7 times, get up 8. And actually, you have to believe that failure is something positive. So in a way, you have to embrace failure and never be afraid of failing, because once you're afraid, um, you're gonna feel uncomfortable and you're gonna think about, in a negative way. You're gonna come into this negative self-talk. So just fail and think, well, that's fine. I'm gonna change. I have plan B, backup plans. So that's from the mental part. As for the technical part, I think I always wanted to do ADR, because there are very few people, like, there's one operator doing ADR in my country, or there was one at that time when I came back from Amsterdam. So I knew I have to master ADR to kind of make a difference. And I liked it much, right? I think it's very elegant. I know integrate wiring, because we have this ongoing battle, is the best way to solve out the case, of course, right? But once you fail, then you have to decide about retrograde or ADR. So I knew from the very get-go, I want to master ADR. Now, uh, reverse cards, and it was like sometimes you have difficult reverse card, right? But you can master that. It's all about thinking about your base of operation. Where are your wires? What kind of scenario you have out of these four, and use guide extensions. So that's not much of a deal, I think.
And I think you're very right about the ability to bounce back is huge for complex. I mean, for anything, but especially for complex procedures like the ones we're doing, which are very unpredictable in some way. How do you deal with the complications? Obviously, these are happening, and they're more likely to happen when you do complex PCI. So, do those set you back? How do you deal with them?
Well, that's hard stuff. I think once you're a complex PCI operator, you're gonna have complications, and you're gonna have the most horrible complications as well, and that makes a toll on you and your life. I always was the guy who was, thinking about that, and that was, giving me a very hard time. And I think you should have someone to talk with about this kind of thing once you get a complication, like a friend, or a colleague, or your family, most importantly. Um, and there are many aspects, right? You wanted to help because the patient is the most important person. You shouldn't put your ego in front of the patient, and it didn't work. And to make things even worse, there was a complication. So, and there are like many other aspects, like you think about other people looking at you. It might affect your CTO PCI program. I remember that's gonna be like a personal statement. I remember one of my big complications when I was having a hard time, and I was talking to my family, particularly my wife, and also a good friend of mine who is not a doctor, um, and that helped me so much. And I was also texting and talking to Paul, who actually gave me this message. Well, uh, if you don't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen, right? And and that was also a game changer, right? This guy knows how to deal with other people from the psychological point of view. It might work. It might not work on everyone. It worked on me, right? I think the most important and the key thing is that you don't go for a long break, like 2 weeks or 3 weeks, because then you're gonna think about that, and that's gonna come back and bite you, day by day. I think you should go. I think you need like a short break. You might need a short break, but then you should um, actually, go back on the horse and start doing this again. But the take-home message: most of the complications are preventable. Most of the time, it's a series of complications. So it's not like one uh, complications, but there is one, and this one drives the other one, and the other one drives another one. So I think it's important to look at it with a grain of salt, and then maybe think about the words of wisdom of Antonio Colombo, who used to say that a complication is not a complication until it's solved. So you can always solve a complication once you keep your nerves, you think in a logical way, and you have a team. And that's why and how the dual operatorship is so important, I think.
Wonderful. And actually, that brings us, I know you've done some great work on stress and the impact of procedures, and you had this JAK interventional paper, which is very nicely showing that the blood pressure goes up, the heart rate goes up. How did that come along? How did you get the idea, and how did that you inspire to get this done?
That's a good question. Well, Manos, I used to play chess in a professional way when I was a child in the elementary school, and I mean, I just heard, and I'm following chess, the competitive chess nowadays quite often. And I saw a study about professional chess players playing blitz, or rapid chess in a very fast way, being monitored actually with, this ABPM device. And then I said, well, maybe we could translate that into CTO PCI because it's a stressful procedure, right? So that's how I came up with this idea, and then we started doing that. We actually did it with one center and then two centers, and then they asked us, well, maybe you should expand that to more operators. So all in all, we finished up with 4 centers.
Perfect. And then I know for the people that are not familiar to this, can you just give us a brief outline? What was the key thing? I know the blood pressure went up, the heart rate. What was the key thing in your mind, and how would that change what we do next?
Yeah. So the key conclusion of our study was that number one, CTO-PCI resulted in higher heart rate as well as arterial blood pressure compared to normal activities in the cath lab or outside the cath lab. It also resulted in significantly higher blood pressure and heart rate compared to non-CTO-PCI procedures. The kind of normal stuff. And finally, that was quite striking. CTO-PCI resulted in a higher heart rate compared to STEMI-PCI, right? So I think that was the most interesting finding from my point of view, because, in ST acute elevation MI, you rescue the patient, you're fighting for life, and we are more kind of, improving the quality of life. So we are not, at least we don't have randomized data. We are not adding years to life, but life to years, right? So that was the most striking one. And the last conclusion was that a failed procedure resulted in more stress, which was actually reflected by these parameters compared to successful CTO-PCI. And the interesting thing was that all of this, increase in heart rate, and actually mostly heart rate, was proportional to the duration of CTO-PCI procedures. Because I hypothesized, I assumed maybe it's gonna be like, it's gonna go up until you wire that CTO, right? And then it's gonna go down because you already relax and you go for the ballooning IVUS and, standing and post dilatation. But it wasn't the case. I mean, it went up during the whole procedure. So that was quite striking for me.
So essentially, we shouldn't be doing CTO-PCI. This is bad for the operator in more ways. We're always talking about the radiation, that you get more radiation with the CTO because of the higher dose for the patient and for you. But now it looks like it's bad for the health in other ways with the heart rate and the blood pressure.
Yeah.
So how do you manage that? And what is your thoughts of how this can be? First of all, should it be prevented? Because maybe that blood pressure, heart rate prepares you for trouble. But it might have a negative effect long term, maybe. So what is your take on this? Is this really a detrimental process for the operator?
Well, I don't know, Manos. I cannot give you the right answer. What I know is that standing in front of the patient and the screen for a very long time and wearing this heavy lead and then being exposed to radiation might not be, as you rightly point out, the most healthy style of life. I know we are stressed, and that's definitely a stressful procedure, and then it might be a sign that your heart rate and your blood pressure goes up. But maybe you can look at it from the positive point of view, a sportsman, right, who is exposed to kind of stress, and he has a goal, he's shooting for a goal, and he's trying to help the patient and open up the CTO or do any kind of complex PCI, and he's stressed, but that's kind of a positive stress, although it must not always be the case, because one of our friends who was involved in the study, he actually was a healthy guy, but after this study he started taking the pills because he had huge hypertension, right? So maybe there are more of us like that, and that might make a difference. I think we should look into this subject much more in the future.
No, absolutely. And as you say, I think it's a good time for understanding the quality of life, the burnout, the issues with intense professions like doing complex PCI. But how do you deal with it? Do you exercise? Do you do relaxation techniques? How do you deal with the stresses associated with these complex procedures?
Well, I love sport. Mainly, I swim a lot. I'm, crazy about swimming, and I've been doing that for quite a long time since early medical studies. So I try to swim like at least 3 times a week, and I enjoyed that much. It's making me relaxed, and it's also a good time to think about life, about sometimes your scientific goals. It's actually like recharging your batteries, at least for myself. So I swim a lot, and then I used to play soccer in the past, but I don't have much time, and I'm not much into it nowadays. Uh, and also, I sometimes I play chess, with my iPhone, which makes me relaxed as well. By the way,
So
by the way, I'm sorry to disturb you.
I don't know.
Chess actually imitates, I think, CTO PCI in a way, so it makes me closer. I think there are many things which are in common. They're both competitive. It's all about the complexity and strategy, right? You always have plan A, plan B, plan C. You have to spot patterns. Uh, so there are many things in common, and you always have to plan ahead. Actually, like you do something in CTO PCI, uh, and you always have to know your next move. Actually, so what I like, and I learned that actually from both Paul and Alex, and particularly from Simon and Colm, is that they work in a quite quick manner and quick fashion. So they do something, and they already ask for a device which they're gonna use in 5 minutes time. So that's something I like going ahead.
Absolutely. So, and as you say, it is a strategy game, and I hadn't heard this analogy of CTO PCI with chess, but now that you think about it, I think you're absolutely right, Maximilian, because it does. You're right. You have to think 2 steps ahead, and if you call for the caster now, you save yourself 2 minutes, which can play a role in the long run and after multiple attempts. Now, when it comes to um, like other things, I know you do a lot of research as well, right? So it's not just the clinical component, but you are one of the relatively few people, actually Paul as well and Alex are big on this, that combines the procedural part, doing the complex PCI, with the studying of it and the studying of various aspects. So how do you manage that, and what are the areas you're most excited about right now?
Well, it's I think you need a passion, right? Because if you need to like that, let's say it this way, because otherwise you're not gonna do it. And once you have a passion that you like, and you combine both science and complex PCI, uh, then it might work, right? So it's not gonna be like work, but more like vacation. Although it's not like an easy way, right? The good thing is that when I do complex PCI, I have like 1 or 2 days a week where I do it in my cath lab. And we are quite relaxed. There are no STEMI comings, no MI. The cath lab is just for CTO PCI. It's the CTO PCI day. So I think doing these cases and not trying to push the envelope and not trying to do science um, would be a shame from my point of view. So I always try to do something like 2 things at the same time. As for the areas and fields I'm looking now, so there are actually two main things. So number one, I'm being concentrated on the use of drug-coated balloons in CTO PCI. I launched actually a retrospective registry, which is to be the biggest one in the world. Although it's quite a competition when you compare yourself with Chinese and South Korean. But we might break it, we might do it. So that's the one thing. It's a retrospective, and then I've already launched and I already started off a prospective single center, just my center study about the use of drug-coated balloons after antegrade, retrograde, true-to-true wiring with a lot of imaging. So we do CT scan before the procedure. We do high definition IVUS, and we're gonna do for FFR. We're gonna go for FFR, and we're gonna measure that, after opening CTO, after ballooning, after one-to-one pre-dilatation, after the procedure with the drug-coated balloon. Then we're going to take the patients back at 6 months follow-up. We're going to repeat all the measurements. We're even going to repeat the CT. And the main, it's just not about, doing a lot of stuff and not thinking, but the main idea behind this study is to try to select the best responders based on imaging to the use of drug-coated balloon, because I think, I suspect it's not going to be like everything white and black, as in medicine, right? So there are going to be the responders and people who are going to benefit more from the stents. But all in all, I think it's quite interesting to reduce the length of the metallic stents, which seem to be the most important predictor of MACE at follow-up, actually, both in CTO, PCI as well as in non-CTO PCI interventions. So that's number one. And the second area is, occupational hazard. As you rightly know, I applied for a grant. It all depends whether I'm going to get it, so I'm not going to, talk about that in much detail, but I would like to look at the occupational hazard as well.
Yeah, and absolutely. And this is actually an area where, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of awareness that not just for CTO, but in general, interventionalists, radiation, stress, there are many things that could have an adverse impact, and trying to mitigate those stresses can play a huge role. Are you using any specific devices for radiation protection in your cath lab at this time?
We would love to have Rampart, but we don't, right? So what I do, I actually look at it in a very detail, and I can recall we had this annual conference in Warsaw. It's called Warsaw CTO Symposium, and last year I gave a fun title for Mihailo Kovacic, who was in your podcast, and he's I think the great person to talk about that, because he has these tips and tricks about how to reduce radiation. And the title was something like "Radiation I Fear More Than My Wife." So as for coming back to your question, maybe I'm not so feared about radiation as Mihailo is, but I'm quite aware that you have to do everything possible to reduce radiation. So I most of the time work with 4 frames per second during fluoroscopy. And then I try to reduce radiation as much as I can, not having, the game changers as you wish, like, the systems from the 2 vendors actually, which are available now. So I think about that. And, I've been doing these cases nowadays in quite a high number. Like I do 150 CTO PCI a year, which is, I think, already unhealthy. So I try to think about that.
And how were you able to introduce? I know that you said in Poland in your center they were not doing it. Then you trained, you came back. How easy or difficult was it to convince people that this is worthwhile and get support to grow the program to the great heights that you're taking it right now?
Yeah. I think it's a very important question, particularly for people who like to kick it off in their centers. So for me, I was quite focused, and I was laser focused on setting up a CTO PCI program in my center. I was kind of hell-bent on doing that because I came back from Amsterdam. I spent there 9 months. That was a great sacrifice of my family. I wasn't here, and I said, well, with all of the sacrifices, I have to do it. I have to succeed in a way. And there was, by the way, an unmet need. A lot of patients suffering in my country, having poor quality of life, because that was impossible, right? And you have a lot of naysayers. We cannot do it. We cannot do it. And I think it was Nelson Mandela who used to say, it's all impossible until it's done, right? So you can do it. It's all about the techniques and having a strategic planning, um, which is even more important, I think. So I was, focused, and I think to succeed, actually, you need two things. First, support of your boss, which I do have. I'm lucky enough to have support of my boss and my institution to pursue this track. And then you shouldn't be afraid of failure. And I'm coming back to the statement I used to say: you have to brave the risk of failure. And maybe you should start with easier cases, and you should expound in a more gradual way, so that you start with easy cases and then you go to the more complicated ones, so that you're not you don't wish yourself actually to you start with huge complications. And once you're on this track, you're gonna succeed, and you're gonna be a good operator, and you're gonna do these procedures in a safe manner, which is the most important thing for the patients. And after that time, there will be a line of patients trying to and coming to your centers, because you're setting a high quality. And the last point, I think, you need to go for dual operatorship. It's very important. It's going to reduce time of your CTO PCI. It's going to reduce the number of bad things happening in the cath lab. It's going to be like vacation and not work, because you're going to enjoy your time with your friend. And I'm lucky enough to have a co-partner in my center.
Wonderful. And that, exactly the people who have that option, as you said, I think it makes perfect sense. There's not really hard data behind it, but I think everyone feels like it and agrees that having two sets of eyes and ears and hands really makes a difference, especially when things get more complex and you need the calmness and you want to think and do the best thing that is possible. Now, you have been one of the pioneers again on the CT for CTO PCI, and actually I think the world is catching up in ourselves now. We're doing much more coronary CT before both CTO but also non-CTO PCI. How much do you use it now, and what do you think is the future for the CT guidance for CTO and PCI in general?
Well, I think there is no escape. I think the future is bright. Right. I just look at the guidelines. I mean, cardiac CT is recommended as the first diagnostic test in most of the patients. And I think it was Antonio Colombo again who used to say that, invasive coronary angio is going to be consigned to history as a diagnostic tool. And that was actually the same case with the prior director of my institution who believed in CT. Professor Różyło, who was the pioneer in interventional cardiology in Poland, and that's how he said, well, we're gonna start with CT early on, and nowadays we have two scanners. I think rarely, we never ever do much diagnostic angio anymore now, because we know that once you go for CT, you're gonna go for a very planned, precise procedure. You can plan your procedure beforehand, and you don't have to cannulate of all of the vessel. You can be actually selective, particularly in post-CABG patients, right? So I think all in all, the future is bright. You can already prep for your case. You can select your strategy beforehand. You can benefit from seeing the proximal cup. You can benefit from seeing the distal target in a full brightness. And you can see, most importantly, calcium. And you can already predict which kind of devices you're going to use to debulk calcium. Then you can use CT coordination in the cath lab. So, so many things coming into play. So, and still, when I'm at the live courses and I see the live cases, and people are struggling, right? People are struggling. And eventually someone says, well, did you run cardiac CT, right? And most of the time the answer is no. So, and that are the cases. The most difficult cases, by the way, are the cases that that gonna benefit most from cardiac CT, right? Like post-CABG patients, cases CTO lesions with ambiguous proximal cap, right? So all in all, I think the future is bright, and we're gonna use it much more in the future.
Yeah, no, I could not agree with you more. I think you're right. This is happening more and more, both in the US and I think also in Europe in many ways. So, yes, this is exactly what's going to happen. And speaking of the future, what are the things that excite you the most for CTO and complex PCI in general right now? Apart from DCB that you mentioned
Right.
you're working
So
already.
definitely TD-ADR, so tip detection ADR. So I actually saw that first time on Twitter half a year ago. There is a guy who is posting these cases from Japan, Dr. Fujita from Sapporo, and I was, very surprised in a positive way. And I said, well, maybe I could try this technique. And then I actually went to Sapporo. I was lucky enough to be there. And I think the first one who went there, I texted the guy on Twitter and he said, wonderful person, by the way. I would even call him a mentor of mine nowadays. He invited me and I went there and I spent there like a few days in the cath lab in Sapporo. And I learned TD-ADR. I didn't learn all the steps because they present the contemporary TD-ADR, which differs in a way from the very first Okamura study and Okamura technique. They actually, to make the whole story short, they want to combine both IVUS and coronary angio so that you stick with IVUS and you see that guide wire which diverges at the screen so that you are not sticking to the screen or outside the screen, but you can see some kind of angle. So there are 4 steps to do so. I stopped at step number 2, but I already did 2 successful procedures in my center, and I think it's a game changer because you go for a very precise re-entry. And people say, well, you cannot do it because we don't have short tip. I was outside Japan. We don't have CP12 short tip. Well, I think, and that are the naysayers, by the way, I think everything is possible. So I did with longer tip, let's say this way, I was and the regular CP12, right? And it worked. And it's very, I'm enjoying this procedure so much because it's different type of procedure. It's like mitral clip, by the way, because you need this dual operatorship so much because one of the operators is sticking and he's taking the advice of the other one who is actually moving and doing the small pullbacks to differentiate the tip of the guide wire from the shaft of the guide wire, which is key in this technique. So actually, it's quite lucky to be the first operator because the second operator is gonna tell you how to turn and how to rotate the guide wire, where to make a re-entry. So that's the thing I'm most fascinated about now.
Yeah, and I know there's a lot of excitement about this here as well. And actually, you're right. You can use the Boston HD IVUS, and actually that works out as well.
Correct.
There's enough overlay you can actually see it. So that sounds perfect. So, Maximilian, what are the things from the many great things you've done so far that you are most proud of, both personally and professionally?
Well, personally, I'm most proud of my family. I have 2 wonderful children, a boy and a daughter. My daughter is 9 years old. My son is almost 7. And they
You're busy.
yeah, and I'm
Congratulations.
very lucky, and I love looking at them and seeing how they evolve and how they changed. I'm blessed with my wife who didn't escape from me. I'm quite a workaholic, right? So I'm mostly proud of my family. I'm very frank about that. As for professional life, I'm proud about kicking off and setting up the CTO PCI program in my center, with almost 80% of patients getting CT beforehand. We do it with CT co-registration, and I think that's unique. Nowadays, it's the biggest CTO PCI program in Poland. getting referrals from whole of the country, even from other countries as well. I'm proud about setting up Warsaw CTO PCI Symposium. This year we had the 5th edition, and we're gonna make it next year hopefully. And then I'm proud about my scientific work, which you already mentioned, so I'm not gonna go into very details about that.
Well, again, congratulations again. It's amazing what you have achieved and a testament to what can happen when you put your mind down and you, as you say, you laser focus on the things you want to achieve, and then great things can happen down the line. Now, do you have a favorite book or favorite movie?
Well, I do. I'm not much into books nowadays. I don't have much time. So when I was younger, I loved the book Plague from Albert Camus. That was the book I read 3 times in the past. It's kind of, it always reminded me we have to be aware, and there is, people are both good and bad, and there is kind of evil part or element in everyone, and but there is like a positive message once you think about that, and I think you should think things might work in a positive way, right? So that's the book I like, and I also like the book How Life Imitates Chess from Garry Kasparov, which I always think about in my life. It helped me in many ways, not just in CTO PCI. As for movies, I much like Roman Polanski, particularly his first movie, which was Knife in the Water. It was, a Polish movie back in the, I think, early 60s, which was quite interesting. It's not so known, I think, outside Poland, where the couple goes for vacation. They meet a hitchhiker, and this hitchhiker spurs some conflict between the couple, and that's very interesting. It's all actually screened and played at the lake part of Poland, which I much like. I like the Ghostwriter from Polanski. And then I love the movies of Clint Eastwood, like Gran Torino or The Mule, right? So that are the movies I like much.
Wonderful. And how many hours do you sleep every day or every night?
Well, it depends. It's a good question. Like, last week we had Euro PCR in Europe, and I slept like 5 or 4 hours a day. But then when the good thing about myself is that once I have time and I have opportunity, I can sleep for a very long time. So I've never had problems with sleeping, and I think it's important because then you can actually recharge your batteries, and then you're back on the horse, and you can work more. So but most of the time I sleep like 6 hours a day.
Wonderful. So Maximilian, again, you've done phenomenal work setting up an amazing program at your center, helping a lot with understanding the burnout, the role of coronary CT, many studies. And you've clearly worked your way, as you mentioned, as a medical student, progressively towards the goal. For people who are at early stages of their career, either students or cardiologists or interventional cardiologists or fellows, what are your pieces of advice? What is the key to success?
So number one, find a passion. Because once you find a passion, then you are shooting for a goal, and what gives you actually a lot of joy, and you're gonna embrace that, and you're not gonna feel like working. It's gonna feel like being on vacation. That's number one. I think in complex PCI, as I already mentioned, you have to brave the risk of failure. You shouldn't be afraid of failure. Failing is good. It's actually 99% of success. And the most difficult thing, number three, I think, you should, once you go to complex PCI, you should have this 1,000-hour rule, right? So you have to be a domain expert. Then there is a danger actually, so that you might be entrapped by this knowledge. So the trick is, and I think it might be intentional in a way, so that you always keep the beginner's mind, right? So you are a domain expert, but you are trying to think about, the things and posing the questions, which might seem stupid because you still have this beginner's mind. And that's what's gonna make you, embrace the new techniques, new devices. That's the thing which gonna keep you on the roll, and which gonna give you a lot of joy and enthusiasm in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. That's true not only for CTO-PCI, but for everything else as well. So Maksymilian, thank you again so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to discuss today. Congrats again on everything you have achieved. Super excited to work with you, and looking forward to, as you said, a bright future.
Thank you, Manos. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Sensei podcast.